It was a morning wrapped in the chill of early spring, where maple leaves hadn't yet returned to their trees, but hope and history stirred in the crisp air. Ottawa's Parliament Hill stood stately and still, except for the soft echo of footsteps, meticulously polished black boots on stone. The royal standard was raised. The king had arrived. For the first time since his coronation, King Charles III embarked on a symbolic journey across the Atlantic to Canada, a nation deeply interwoven with the monarchy's past, and one navigating its own path toward reconciliation and reinvention. At the heart of this tour was not the usual royal pageantry, though there was still plenty of it, but rather a private, powerful meeting held behind the doors of Rideau Hall. There, under the warm dome of its historic ceilings, Governor-General Mary Simon welcomed His Majesty, not with formalities alone, but with openness, clarity, and a shared sense of duty. The room was set simply. No gilded fanfare, just 2 chairs, a small table with Labrador tea, and a quiet sense of history in the making. It was here the 2 leaders sat, not as monarch and representative, not as guest and host, but as 2 people deeply engaged with the fabric of a country seeking unity between its traditions and its truths. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Canada is not the same place it was even a decade ago, Mary Simon said with a calm steadiness. And that's a good thing. King Charles nodded, his gaze drifting briefly to the window, where snow still graced the lawns. Nor should it be, he replied. Change, though often uncomfortable, is the truest form of progress. Their conversation, candid and unscripted, would later be described as a turning point, a subtle yet symbolic pivot in how the Crown engages with the realities of the modern Commonwealth. Roots and reconciliation. Born in the small Arctic village of Kanjiksualujuak, Quebec, Mary Simon is Canada's first Indigenous Governor-General. Her very appointment sent ripples across a nation long in the process of reckoning with its colonial legacy. King Charles, now stepping more fully into his role as sovereign, knew the symbolic gravity of their meeting. You grew up on the land, he said, a genuine interest laced into his tone. That gives one a different sense of time, doesn't it? Mary Simon smiled. Time and space. In the North, everything feels vast, physically, spiritually. That shapes how you understand community, responsibility, truth. King Charles leaned in. And pain, too, I imagine. History doesn't easily loosen its grip. There was a moment of stillness. Simon nodded. But we loosen it by naming it, by listening. That's how healing begins. That's why this visit matters. The king, often described as deeply interested in environmental causes and Indigenous knowledge systems, appeared moved. It was clear this wasn't just a ceremonial chat. They were peeling back the layers, speaking, not about what should be said, but what needed to be heard. The Crown must evolve, Charles said. Not to maintain relevance, but to maintain integrity. Simon raised her cup. To evolution then. Beyond symbolism, what the visit means. While the monarch's visit was filled with the usual engagements, visiting local leaders, touring schools and cultural centers, attending remembrance ceremonies, it was this private dialogue with Mary Simon that would resonate most powerfully across Canada's communities. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Aides and officials would later recount how both leaders intentionally carved out several hours to speak without notes, without press, and without pretense. They spoke about the Indian residential school system and the slow, still ongoing process of truth and reconciliation. Charles listened as Mary described the silence that echoed through many Indigenous homes. Whole generations deprived of their languages, ceremonies, families. The silence is no longer acceptable, she said. It must be replaced with acknowledgement and action. Charles responded not with defensiveness, but with depth. The Crown must play its part in listening, in learning, in supporting healing, not with mere statements, but with sustained presence. They also touched on climate change, a subject close to both their hearts. In a rare point of shared legacy, they noted the convergence of traditional ecological knowledge and modern science. Our ancestors observed the land closely, Simon noted. There's wisdom there we need more than ever. Wisdom doesn't belong to history, Charles said. It belongs to the future. A new chapter for the monarchy in Canada? The Canadian public has long had a complicated relationship with the monarchy. Recent years have seen calls to reconsider the nation's constitutional ties to the crown. And while no constitutional changes were on the table during this visit, the tone was noticeably different. There was humility. There was dialogue. There was presence. The King's itinerary included visits to Indigenous communities in the Northwest Territories, where he met with elders, students, and survivors of the residential school system. In one village, he planted a birch tree beside a community healing center, a living symbol of growth, rootedness, and renewal. Back in Rideau Hall, Charles and Mary Simon continued their discussion over a quiet lunch. The topics ranged from the preservation of Inuktitut to the idea of creating a new permanent council that would foster ongoing Crown, Indigenous relationships. Symbols alone are not enough, Simon said. We need new structures. Charles agreed. We need to build a legacy that is not just remembered, but felt. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Public reaction, a shift in tone. Following the visit, commentators across Canadian media noted the markedly different tone of the King's presence. Headlines didn't just focus on ceremonial dress or royal waves, they honed in on the King's genuine attempts at engagement, his openness to learning, and the striking warmth between him and Governor-General Simon. Social media was abuzz with images of the two walking side by side in quiet conversation, of Charles kneeling to speak directly to a child offering him a hand-drawn picture of the Northern Lights, of Simon offering him a small carved polar bear, a token of peace, strength, and the Arctic spirit. It wasn't pomp and pageantry that made this visit memorable. It was the humanity, legacy in the making. As the King's Canadian tour drew to a close, his departure felt less like a goodbye and more like a beginning. For a country that continues to wrestle with its identity, torn between colonial roots and post-colonial reckoning, this visit offered a rare moment of hope, of direction, of honest dialogue. Charles, though bound by tradition, appeared increasingly willing to let that tradition bend. Mary Simon, while a steward of state, also serves as a steward of truth. Together, they reflected the duality of Canada, ancient yet modern, grieving yet growing. As the jet lifted off Canadian soil, the air still cool but slightly softened by spring's approach, a question hung in the sky like the contrails above. Can an ancient institution truly serve a modern nation? If this visit offered any answer, it was this. Yes, if it listens, if it learns, and if it leads with humility. Final thoughts. In many ways, this meeting between King Charles III and Governor-General Mary Simon was not a political event, but a cultural one. It was not scripted, but sincere. Not a statement of power, but a gesture of partnership. Canada, like so many nations today, is a place in transition, its identity constantly rewritten by voices that once went unheard. If the monarchy is to remain relevant, it must do more than wave from balconies. It must walk the land, hear its stories, carry its truths, and maybe, just maybe, plant a few more birch trees along the way. Subscribe the channel to get such videos.